Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to my presentation on human gait throughout the life cycle for KIN 332, Lifelong Learner Development. My name is Daniel McCullough, and this is my critical assignment. So, a little overview of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be going over basic theories and principles of each stage of development, how gait differentiates and evolves throughout the life cycle, common gait abnormality and constraints at each stage. And I'm going to explain what that is in just 1 second. Alright, so constraints, what are they? Well, it's based on Newell's model of constraints. It was developed in 1986, and it means that motor actions are influenced by 3 separate factors. Now, these are individual constraints, task constraints, and environmental constraints. So individual constraints would be something like structural or functional, where structural would be someone's height or weight, or potentially either bone deformities, or maybe they have natural kyphosis or scoliosis. That would be structural, versus functional constraints would be their ability to perform based on maybe perception, right? Or something like autism spectrum disorder. Task constraints, this would be rules of a specific task. So let's say I have to throw a ball, but I'm not allowed to move from my current position. That would be an example of a task constraint. That's going to change how I perform the action. Last one's going to be environmental constraints. So maybe the ground is made of a slippery surface. That's going to change how I walk across it, of course. And these are just examples of different types of constraints modeled under Newell's theory. So let's talk a little about early childhood. So normal abnormalities we view with gait would be in and out toeing. So this is going to be either when the feet splay outward a bit, so that'd be out toeing, or in toeing is when they rotate inwards. And you'll generally notice this. Children, it's also called pigeon-toed. Other variations of abnormalities would be bow-legged or knock-knees. So this is varus and valgus. Think of it, the knees go outward or the knees go inward. And that can be caused by torsion, which would be basically rotation, version, which has to do with how the bone is rotated, and then flat feet would be another common cause. So this is basically when you just don't have that arch on bottom, and it's pretty common with children developing. Alright, another theory would be joint mobility. So we often see young children, like 12 months old, they'll have a very wide stance, and this will make them a lot more clumsy or seem a lot more mobile when they're walking, because the more stability we require, the less mobility is then afforded. So let's think about something like the knee. It tends to be a more stable joint. It's not going to have quite as much mobility as something like the shoulder, which is a very mobile joint. It's also very commonly torn. There's a lot of issues with shoulders because there's not a lot of stability. Right, so common constraint when it comes to children about 12 months old is going to be perceptual. So basically how they see things around them, right? Spatial awareness, whether or not they know where something is. Let's say they don't know where a wall is, they'd be more likely to hit that. They don't know where other people are, right? That's going to change how they move around. Significant others. Now this isn't your romantic partner. This has to do with maybe something like how you're interacting with people in your environment. Maybe someone's distracting you over there. Say, hey, come get this ball. That's going to be a significant other. And there's other individual constraints such as autism spectrum disorder, which will cause some abnormalities in gait, and metatarsus adductus, which is basically an issue with your metatarsals, toes, where it adducts in, which means it comes medially. Here's a little video, and we could just see some differences in their gait. I'm not going to play the whole thing. Very wide stance, very clumsy, a lot of movement. The arms are held very high. There's not a lot of reciprocal arm strings, so there's not going to be a lot of stability. The kid is also very loud and does not like that this person is picking them up. That's not a constraint, just an observation. There we go. Let me see, there we go, right thing. There we go. So, theories of development for toddlers. they're going to have generally a shorter stride and transition compared to adults. So this is going to allow for a little more stability because they're not quite sure of themselves yet. They don't have everything developed well enough to have that narrow stance. And this is the same thing we actually see with elderly people. So because they're less sure of their stability, they have to take everything a lot slower, a lot shorter, right? The transition is going to be smaller so that they could stay on their feet. Now, compared to the younger child, so 12 months, we're going to be talking about 30 months right here. The gait is going to be a lot more narrow. The stance or the arms are going to be much lower, and there's going to be some presence of a reciprocal arm swing to help with mobility and stability. All right, it's a counterbalance. We do that to help counter where the other leg is moving. Keeps us from falling over. All right, common abnormalities with an older toddler. So again, we're talking 30 months old. There's going to be a lot of toe walking. Now, I said this is potentially idiopathic. Idiopathic meaning we don't know what the exact cause of it is. There could be actual causes you could pinpoint down, but for the most part, most toddlers have idiopathic toe walking. One idea is maybe it's hypertonia or increased tension among the calves, not allowing for the heel to go down. But we're not going to see that heel strike that we generally see with adults. It's all going to be on their tippy toes. Again, more constraints will be significant others. So, like we mentioned earlier, potentially other people in the room, how they're interacting, right? Hypertonia, like I mentioned earlier, is basically too much resistance to movement. Your muscles have too much tone, right? ASD or autism spectrum disorder, potential nervous system disorders, right? Stuff like cerebral palsy, that's all going to affect it. Right? And then task constraints, such as timing and pace requirements for schools or activities. If you have to march to a metronome, for instance, or something's happening in your school and you have to march together, some age groups are going to have an easier time than others adapting to it. So the stride is going to be different. Maybe what they have to do to compensate for more stability or for a longer stride length is going to change how their gait looks overall. Right? And then here's just a neuro exam of a 30-month-old. We're going to take a look at this real quick and break it down a bit. So we notice a little more reciprocal arm swing. We don't see a lot of heel strike. Every time she walks, she's very much on her tippy toes. The calves are constantly activated. So the gastrocsoleus, or you say gastrocnemius and the soleus, either way, it's just the calf muscles. There's still a little bit of stumbling. It's a little more narrow stance compared to the last one. But there's going to be significantly more abnormalities than with a normal adult, which is what we generally measure or we use as a baseline for normal gait.
Very good. Point that to mom.
All right. So let's move on to adults. The theories of development for adults. We consider this the baseline for normal gait in terms of stride length, heel strike patterns. That's basically when they lead with their heel at the strike of the or at the start of the gait cycle. Right? There's going to be more pelvis rotation and reciprocal arm swing. So the thing we talked about earlier, where your arms meet the active contralateral leg. All right. So there's a 60-40 swing cycle ratio. So this means the swing phase to the stance phase. The swings phase, of course, is that time where you have the leg in the air, getting swinging into the next part of the stance, which is basically when you get the heel strike, the feet are on the ground. So there's going to be a 60-40 ratio. Right, so the majority of the time is spent actually in the air, swinging that leg, getting ready, causing knee flexion, then striking with that heel for the stance. Right, there's going to be a separation and clear movement through all the phases of the gait. So we could clearly see each individual phase having to do with the gait cycle, whether it be the pre-swing, mid-swing, mid-stance, terminal swing, all that. We could clearly see all those patterns when we break it apart. Compared to a toddler, where there might be a lot less slow transition, you might have to pick it apart a lot more. You might see them stumbling through or kind of limping. And then the last one is mostly theoretical mathematics, because mathematicians have to have their greedy little weird theoretical hands and everything. The reverse pendulum model, I'm not going to go too far into this. If you want to read more about it, you can. It's basically just a mathematical theory behind what perfect gait would look like, or a perfect gait cycle. Its optimization, what it should be. And the reverse pendulum model, if I had a graph, I could explain it a little better. But it basically just has to do with the normal movement pattern we see with adults. Alright, so normal abnormalities. In this case, we're going to be using the adult in the next video for abnormalities I could see. There's some slight out-toeing in it, but it's grossly normal. Grossly being not a close analysis of it, it's mostly normal. Right? It's within the normal confines of what we expect for gait. There's going to be some minimal pelvic and trunk rotation for this next adult upcoming, but it's still grossly within normal parameters. Constraints, maybe he had an athletic injury at some point. Maybe the ground is slippery, because it does look like he's by a pool, or maybe in a swimsuit. There's also potential psychological influences. Maybe he's afraid of getting injured. Maybe he's afraid of a particular thing in the environment. And of course, there's a significant other. So who's in the room with him? What's the specific task going on? So let's take a look at this. So
during stance and swing, there are multiple subcategories of gait called phases. Each phase is distinguished by a combination of joint motion.
Now, he's not going to have as much rotation as we normally expect. You can see at the pelvis and the hip. There's still a good amount of knee flexion, which is a good thing. We still see him leading with that heel strike. There's reciprocal arm swing, and they're not raised high. He has a relatively narrow stance compared to the previous, the children before him. So this is grossly normal gait. This would be, okay, I don't really interpret any big issue. If I was a physical therapist, I'd say, maybe he's gotten injured before, but I don't see any significant impairment. All right, so let's move on to older adults. Of course, as we get older, things are going to start to get a little dicey, right? Things start to degenerate a bit. So antalgic gait, what is this? Well, this is basically a shortened stance phase due to pain. That could be like arthritis. It could be, a sedentary lifestyle could lead to a lot of pain. It could just be tension. But when you have increased pain, you're more likely to do this kind of limp. So that's that shortened stance phase. They quickly transition, and it appears as if it's a limp. Right? We also have declining neurological abilities leading to stability issues. So the perception is going to be off. Their spatial awareness is going to be off, and maybe they even have neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's, right? It's going to cause a decrease in stability for them, so they're going to generally compensate with increased hip flexion. And they're going to kind of lean forward. They want a little more stability. They're going to take a shorter stride. They're going to take longer to get to their location. We have all seen videos of like stereotypical old person. They have their cane. They're all hunched over. They're slowly walking, looking at their feet, trying to find their pace. Well, this is kind of that idea. Abnormalities, of course, we got the shortened stance phase, so that antalgic gait pattern we were talking about earlier. You got that limp. Right, we got increased hip flexion, so the hips are they're bent over. And then we got the reduced stride speed and length. So they're not going to walk, step as far, and they're not going to step as quickly. They're not going to finish the cycle as quickly as a normal adult or a younger adult. Constraints include decreased stability, neuromuscular degeneration, so a lot of loss of muscle mass, potentially even the neuromuscular junctions having issues, right? And then we also have arthritis. Typically, it's going to be osteoarthritis, which is the degradation of cartilage among joints. That's going to cause a lot of pain, a lot of inflammation. That's the term of arthritis, is inflammation of the joint. So when bones start to rub together, that causes a significant amount of pain. It's going to be very hard to move around sometimes. All right, and let's just take a look real quick. We're also going to notice here she takes a lot longer to get up. Now, according to Newton's law, right, it's going to take some force to start acting on the object. You need to have something to start acting on the object in order for it to move.
Quando eu falar já, a senhora
Let's
vai
fast forward this
levantar.
just a bit.
Ó, apoiar. E vai lá e volta. Consegue.
There we go. She takes a lot longer to get up. It takes a lot more effort for her. And now we're going to look at her stride. First of all, I can actually notice a little bit of internal rotation in her knees, a little bit of valgus, right? The steps are very slow. She's very hunched over, so increased hip flexion and some knee flexion there to compensate. I even maybe see some kyphosis on her back, though she might just be wearing a harness. It's kind of hard to tell. I believe she's wearing a harness. Well, she's taking her stride very slow and very small. So this is generally what we see in a lot of elderly people who are sedentary or who have diseases and injuries. All right, that's. So these are just my references. You can look at them if you want. But what I learned in the class is Newell's model of constraints. So how our environment, how our our functional limitations and structure influences our gait patterns and our movement. Right? I've learned phases of gait and human locomotion. So I want to go into physical therapy and athletic training and sports medicine in general. This is going to help me immensely when it comes to assessing clients. Clinically, orthopedic surgeons use this. It's very helpful as any kind of applied kinesiologist to understand why your client moves the way they do so you could then fix it. Or see potentially, if you do work with a younger population, if there's any developmental issues, right? So analyzing that gait for clinical reasons, and if you're working with athletes, you can see how they run, you can see how they walk, and then you could then optimize it. I'm probably not going to go into multiple levels of higher mathematics to do it like optimization theory, but it's definitely useful alongside biomechanics. So development of the neuromuscular system and perception was important to learn. As you learn at how the nervous system and how the muscles adapt specifically to allow us to move, how we control our walking or running with essentially controlling it with our plantar flexors, all that stuff. That's actually extremely useful. Then we could maybe pick apart if a client came to me and said, hey, I have this pain only when walking. All right, let me analyze your gait. Let me see. Well, this muscle isn't activated enough. This one's too active. This one likely has an injury, something like that. Right? And then perception. I can notice if maybe someone's not having a good time with walking or locomotion just because they have an issue, either maybe inner ear issue, so the stability is off, or they have no spatial awareness. Right? And something else I learned is my teacher, Dr. Garrett, is a bit of a goofball. It's very funny, like watching, seeing his, even just his introduction. He's wearing a pirate hat, and then for the extra credit, he recorded it as a cowboy. It was a little cringy, not gonna lie. It was still very entertaining, and hopefully I get him in another class someday. Who knows? And then also, adjunct professor, I believe it's Corey Stegman. He was very helpful with his feedback and very timely on the essay, so I thank him as well. All right, that's going to be about it. So let me just exit out of here. Apologize for the lack of editing.